Hello, everyone, and welcome to Plattwoods Church Online. My name is Evie Martin. I'm the lead pastor here. I am a person who has moved around a fair amount in my life. Some of that is due to my personality and disposition. Much of it is due to my vocation. Methodist pastors are all too familiar with relocating to serve various churches across the connection. Here at Plattwoods, perhaps more than other churches I've served, I know we have a high percentage of people who have lived a more nomadic life. Lots of military families in our community. Y'all are used to going where you're sent. Many of you, before remote work became so prevalent, moved a fair amount because of your job. And a good number of you have moved to be closer to your kids or grandkids. I think it's safe to say a vast majority of us have an experience of picking up life in one place and making a move, even if it was a small one, to begin a new chapter in a new place. Last week, we kicked off this January sermon series, Starting Over, by learning from the story of Ruth, that the first step she takes when life throws her a massive curveball and she has to start over, the first step is to choose a person. She aligns herself, her life, with Naomi and begins a new journey with her. And today we return to Ruth's story to discover that her starting over journey very quickly took her to a new and unexpected place. Ruth's story of starting over is one that emerged out of crisis. You can always catch up with last week's full sermon online, but just to refresh quickly, as a young woman, her life was clicking along just fine. She'd found a husband, Naomi's son, hadn't had any kids yet, but her future seemed otherwise secure. But her husband dies, and she and her widowed mother-in-law are living in the land of Moab, where famine has set in. They are grieving, they are hungry, and they have no one to take care of them in this place. Ruth, at a tender age, has to start all over. While we may not have lived Ruth's exact story, a lot of us can relate to the reality of tragedy or trauma, unforeseen circumstances upending our lives. Some of you feel even right now like the rug has been pulled out from under you and you're starting over when you had no plans or intentions to do so. For others, it may not seem quite so dramatic, but a new year brings a new opportunity to put behind us the things that no longer serve us and start over in intentional and healthy ways. Either way, Ruth's story invites us into that adventure with her, as it takes her to a new and very different place. As we've started this new year, I've noticed a social media trend of people celebrating and posting their reading accomplishments from last year, 2022. How many books they read, what their favorites were, and then they're publishing their intended reading list for this year. I missed that boat. I did not share an artistic photo or collage of my literary consumption on Facebook. But I will take this opportunity here to share the best one that I read last year for your own reading list. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson was published in 2010, but I just got around to reading it last year. It's substantial. It took me a long time, but it was worth every moment. It follows three storylines that bring to life our theme for today. Three characters or families who make a giant move in the era of American history known as the Great Migration. Over the course of 50 years in the 20th century, 6 million Black Americans migrated, packed up their lives, and moved from southern states to northern and western states in search of a life free from the shadows of the Jim Crow era that lingered well into the 20th century. If you haven't read it, add it to your list for this year as we lean into this theme of starting over. But the overarching sentiment that fits our theme today comes just in the title itself, The Warmth of Other Suns. That phrase is a line borrowed from a poem by Richard Wright in the 1940s, an author and poet who was himself part of the Great Migration, moving from Mississippi to Chicago. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. Those words, that seminal hope, is beautiful and profound. And I can't help but wonder if some similar song rested on Ruth's lips, perhaps as she stood on the road next to Naomi, turning her back toward her motherland, Moab, the only home she had ever known, and yet a place of heartache and pain, and facing Judah, the city of Bethlehem. Taking herself, the only seeds left of her future, and taking her chances that a different land, another son, might bring about new blooms. What can we learn from Ruth about what it means to start over in a new place? Maybe it's a new physical location. So many of us relocate by our own choosing or by unplanned necessity. But maybe it's a metaphorical new place, a new circumstance or situation we're in, whether we want to be in it or not. First, I think we can learn from Ruth based on where she goes. And then I think we can learn from how she goes there. Ruth lives in Moab, born and raised. Moab is a region, a land not too terribly far from Judah. It's close enough that the two lands have historical overlap in the biblical record, but it lies across the Dead Sea. So a trip there requires going around a large body of water. Still, Moab pops up frequently throughout the Old Testament, sometimes in confrontation with Israel as they squabble over land, but also as a land of sojourn or traveling through. Most notably, it is the land where Moses died, and there that he is buried. But Moab has its own tarnished reputation. It was the land named for Lot's son. Lot was Abraham's nephew. Unfortunately, and listen closely here, while Lot was Moab's father, Moab's mother was Lot's daughter. You get the picture. So Moab, the region, was known as a land and a people with a heritage of licentiousness, immorality, generally speaking. Still, Moab is Ruth's home. For all its faults, it's the only place she has ever known. Her family is there, the language is hers, the rituals and customs are what have shaped her. It is her motherland. Her cross-cultural marriage to an Israelite was the first exposure she had to a world that was not her own. And as the bottom drops out from under her and life takes a different direction, suddenly she feels unmoored, even in her own home. Her husband had become her home, even in her homeland, and now it seemed like maybe other suns might be warmer. She was no longer blooming here. The destination ahead of her is Bethlehem in Judea. That's a name we recognize, a place we maybe know a little more about. But Ruth didn't. We know that it was the place that Rachel, Jacob's wife, was buried. We know that it was the birthplace of David, who would one day become king. We know that it was the birthplace then of Jesus. And we know that the literal name of this quaint little town is House of Bread. Bet, house, lechem, bread. That seems promising for two women who are nearing starvation. House of bread. But Ruth knew that it was far away. She knew the language was similar. She and her husband had figured out how to communicate after all. But she knew she'd always have an accent there. She'd always be marked as an outsider. And of course, she was. Throughout the rest of Scripture even, she's always known as Ruth the Moabite. labeled. She didn't know anyone who lived in Bethlehem except Naomi, who was in a pretty bad mood for most of the story, not a great companion in that regard, and she knew that there was no guarantee that things were going to work out in Bethlehem. Armed with that 5-star review of this city of Bethlehem as her potential new home, she set her course and flung herself into the unknown. There's one other thing that Ruth knows about Bethlehem in Judea. And I think this detail is what reaches across the ages to us today, as we understand more fully, perhaps, why this was the new place Ruth decided to go. In Ruth 1, verse 6, we hear that Naomi arose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field of Moab, because while in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. God was up to something in this faraway and unfamiliar place. People were not hungry. God was at work. In her season of grief and fear and uncertainty, in her starting over moment, Ruth turned her ears, her eyes, her attention to where God was moving and working and tending to life among God's people. And she started walking there. It made a difference in Ruth's life where she headed to start over again, but it also mattered to her story how she showed up once she got there. At the end of chapter 1, we see Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem just as the harvest season is beginning. And here's why I love to look at the literary structure of the books and the stories in our Bible. Naomi is sort of set up as a literary foil to Ruth in an almost exaggerated way. Whatever or however Naomi is, her character serves the purpose of demonstrating that that's what Ruth is not. Naomi is basically an Eeyore at this point. She has whined and complained a lot about being a widow, rightly so. She's blamed God for a lot of things. She quit speaking to Ruth after Ruth pledged her loyalty. They arrived in Bethlehem, and this is what happens. When they arrived at Bethlehem, the whole town was excited on account of them, and the women of the town asked, "Can this be Naomi?" What a reception. She replied to them, "Don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me very bitter." Mara meaning bitter, of course. Thus Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite returned with her. That's the end of chapter 1, and then suddenly in chapter 2, Naomi takes a back seat, and Ruth emerges as the main character of the story for the first time. As a stark counterpoint to Naomi's pessimism and despair, Ruth arrives determined and resolved in this strange, uncertain new place. The first thing that she says, with a telltale accent on her Hebrew, is, "Let me go to the field so that I may glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor." Let me go glean. Let me go find food. We're hungry. We need to eat. Food equals life. Life equals what we came here for. Gleaning was a practice that we find throughout the Hebrew scriptures, whereby workers in the field at harvest time would let some of the grain fall to the ground. And this was intentional so that the poor, and often the women of the community, could come behind and collect what had fallen for their own tables. Ruth's first order of business was to get to work and glean. She knew Naomi couldn't do it. They had no income, still no household to care for them. Ruth fixated on the one task she knew she could do to ensure their survival. And she did it. And she went to sleep and got up, and she did it again. And she slept and she woke and she did it again all the way until the end of the harvest. I emphasize this diligence, this focus, because the text does. In chapter 2, there are all kinds of things going on in the plot, but the word glean occurs 11 times. That's a lot of times for one chapter. It demonstrates Ruth's unwavering commitment to this singular task as she's starting over in a new, unfamiliar place. Nothing distracts her or takes her off course. People are talking about her. She can overhear their murmurs and whispers. Who is this woman? I heard she was from Moab. Moab? Ew. What happened to her husband? And she gleans. Boaz, the owner of the land, notices her, takes an interest, invites her in for dinner. She eats, answers his questions, downs the last of her wine, and heads right back out to glean. Workers tease her, chastise her, yell at her to get out of the way until Boaz tells them not to. She keeps on gleaning. She gleans until the sun goes down. She threshes the barley and takes it to her mother-in-law, and they eat it until they are full. And the next day, she starts all over again. She gleans. Her life now depends on the soil of this new place. She may wither or she may bloom, but she finds the one most important and basic thing that will give life to her and her companion, and she does not stray from that focus, no matter how many distractions threaten to take her off course. As she studies and as she heals, we start to notice blossoms and blooms unfolding around her as God begins to weave her new story here in this strange new place. What does starting over in a new place look like for you in 2023? Maybe you are stepping into a real new physical space, a city, a home, school, or a place of work. Or maybe you're moving into a metaphorical new place, uncharted territory for you in your personal life, your family situation, your job. Maybe the starting over is intentional, something you've wanted. Maybe it's not, and you feel completely unglued. You're grieving. You feel like you've lost everything that matters. You struggle to breathe, see straight, or figure out what to do next. Can Ruth be our starting over guide in leading us to a new place? Even if the new place seems frightening, it might not be our first choice of places to go. Can we look above the horizon of our fear and uncertainty and see what God is already up to there? Because God is always up to something. God is at work bringing things to life in every corner of the world around us and hopes that we will notice and move in for a closer look. When you're starting over and setting your course, can you pay attention first to where it is that people and life are flourishing? Where is your Bethlehem, your house of bread, where people's real needs are being met and people are caring for one another? Where are people coming together, not pushing each other apart? Where are the signs, the pockets of hope, not despair, in the place that lies ahead of you? Where is God up to something? Sometimes when we are people living in trauma and turmoil, we need to look to the places where God is creating quiet and peace. Move in that direction. Sometimes we live in seasons marked by death and grief and loss. God beckons to us from a place where there is life and tenderness and good companions. Other times, this is me most often, when we are people living in comfort and stability, we might feel safe in our bubble. But deep down, we are unfulfilled. God is up to the messy and uncomfortable work of mending broken things around us, and we need to start over, step out, move in that direction. Starting over begs the question of us, where? And the answer to that question can really be any place when we set our course toward what God is up to there. And then once we start our migration, how is it that we will show up there? Can we simplify it as much as Ruth? Can we find the one thing, the most important, most basic thing that will give us life and bring life to people around us? Is it as basic as getting food on the table or fixating on finding a job? Is it zeroing in on the practice of prayer because your soul seems empty and needs to be filled? Is it a physical need that requires your undivided attention until a solution is found so you can be more fully yourself? Is it a renewed attention to playing with your kids because their joy changes your heart in a way no one else can? Is it an exploration into serving with those on the margins in our community because it makes you uncomfortable and your compassion needs a wake-up call to bring you back to life? If you are starting over, like Ruth, show up with the dogged, persistent commitment to one simple thing that will bring you life and that will lift up those around you. Distractions will come, negativity, people wanting that time from you, self-doubt, questions, and your own inexperience. But God is at work around you, tilling the soil of what is to come. Ruth's future is about to unfold. We'll hear that part next week. And your life is about to bloom too. Look for where God is at work in our world as you move into an unlikely new place this year. And arrive there with the hope, the faith, and the expectation that God is going to do something new in you too. Will you pray with me? God, you are already here, and yet, God, you are there. You go before us to new places in our lives, working your goodness, your restoration, your healing in the world. In the times when we struggle to make sense of our circumstances, lift our eyes to see where you are and draw us toward you. Give us clarity when life is blurry, to start over with a task that does not drain us but gives us life. Use it to heal us, to strengthen us, to bring us back to a life in full bloom, a life that spreads life to others too. With hope we pray. Amen.